It's excusable for a politician because they don't know any better. I mean, that's just being a politician. Hello and welcome to this edition of the Wise Medical Minute. About 6 months ago, actually almost 7 months ago, we did a recording about the COVID-19 pandemic when I expressed the concern, what is it they're not telling us? And since that time, it's become apparent that they're not telling us a whole lot. And we're still not hearing everything we need to hear. But looking back at it, realizing the date at which time we had so little information, March 12th, it seems almost prophetic in retrospect. But because of the pattern of things that have happened since then, it's not anything magical or supernatural. This stuff's predictable, including the recent nonsense we've had when even our president and his own recovery failed to respect the virus with adequate intelligent response. I will not say what I was about to say. But anyway, the concept is this virus is with us. This virus is serious. Fortunately, it's usually not fatal. So that's the good news. But when it is fatal, you can't trivialize the fact that over 211,000 people have died. And I truly believe at least a majority of those deaths, had we had a different attitude from the leadership, majority of those deaths would not have had to occur. Now, what I want to address today is we don't need to spend so much time making things like a mask a political statement, okay? Think of the mask as an expression of common courtesy, okay? It's been demonstrated that you can experience this infection more than once. You can have this infection and not know it. And people just encountering you for the first time, they don't know that you may have already recovered, as some more than 7 million people have. So the bottom line is, think of it as a way to say to someone else, I'm not going to give you my germs. And whether or not you're protecting yourself from other people's germs is a whole nother conversation. But the point I'm getting at is, it should not be based on political considerations at all. Now, the next concern is we can literally forget about our government officials for a while. I don't think things are going to get any better after the election, regardless of who wins. Politicians are going to be politicians, and we just have to accept that for what it is. But there are governmental agencies like the CDC and the FDA that once upon a time we could have some faith and confidence in. But at this point in time, even that faith and confidence needs to be restored. So my message today is to challenge medical professionals, if you happen to see this, to raise your standards above that of the politicians. You know, I can't accept physicians making political comments like we've heard on the news recently about our president. You know, it's excusable for a politician because they don't know any better. I mean, that's just being a politician. But when physicians stoop to being politicians, that's unacceptable. That's an insult to my profession, and I challenge other people to no longer tolerate our professional fellow colleagues, you know, and playing politics. Now, the real sad part is a majority of physicians nowadays are not self-employed. Most people work for some corporate entity that's not run by medical professionals. So the lowering of our standards is no doubt on that basis. Yeah. So I really want to encourage people to separate the politics from science. Science is real, whether people want to accept it or not. And medical judgments need to be based on more science, more social considerations, psychological considerations, as well as basic facts that have nothing to do with whether somebody's Republican or Democratic. The virus kills Republicans just like it kills Democrats. And I think we need to be above those kinds of considerations. Now, I also want to readdress a concern I raised in a previous video about vaccines. Now, if you've been following along some of the recent recordings, I did retract my prior position on the vaccines. But my new position is based on interactions now with two physicians, well, two doctors, one's a PhD, who work for the CDC. And I was stunned when the first of the two reported that her family will not be getting the vaccines when they come out. So I'm not going to belabor this point, but I want anyone making recommendations about vaccines to base it on science and not politics. And I do agree with one colleague who said, follow the money. So with these three big companies that got big government grants, I don't want their vaccine either, because they made millions of doses of vaccine prior to verifying that the vaccine was effective. So the bottom line is, if the vaccine is good, then a year from now we can take it. But the science is not there to substantiate that these vaccines that are coming out in the next few months have any degree of reliability as far as efficacy, and it certainly hasn't been tested adequately to say it's safe. So when they ramp up their production of millions of doses, long before they even verify whether something's working or verifying whether it's safe, then they're going to distribute it regardless. So if it's something that they spent that much money on, it may or may not be effective, and they're going to recoup their investment regardless. So let's wait until we can get vaccines that did not come from the big companies that got all the money. So some of the smaller companies will have to overcome the politics that the big companies won't have to overcome. So they're going to have to do it with science and data. So if they get past the politics of the big boys, there's probably a better vaccine that they're distributing. So I'm going to get more data before. I'm just speaking in generalizations now, and that's always dangerous when you start generalizing. But the bottom line is, let's be a little cautious and not as enthusiastic as I once portrayed for these newer ones that are about to come out. Last but not least, the treatments still are evolving. Remdesivir, only thing I'm going to say is, if you're sick enough to be in the hospital, it makes no sense to take a drug like that and then be discharged from the hospital. That's unintelligent. As far as the other drugs, the hydrochloroquine, I don't think it's as dangerous as the opponents are saying it's dangerous, because it's a safe drug that's being used for other indications all the time. But I also don't think the efficacy is there. And I think there's enough risk of danger that we should not be using it prophylactically. In other words, we should not be using it to prevent disease. But when you have little choice for treatment as part of a cocktail of multiple things that might work, I don't have an issue with that. But using it to prevent infection doesn't make sense. And if you use it, whether in the former or the latter context, get an EKG first. If you have a prolonged QT interval before you take the drug's going to make that prolonged QT interval longer. Any competent person who can read an EKG can identify that problem, and those are the people who are at greatest risks if you should endeavor to take the hydroxychloroquine. Now, I'm anxious to hear more in the way of data using the plasma of people who have recovered. Intuitively, if you're sick enough to be in a hospital, that makes sense to me. I don't know if there's going to be a role for that for people who are treated as outpatients. But last but not least, as my final plea to medical professionals, I've given up on the politicians. I don't trust the Republicans. I don't trust the Democrats. I think they're all just politicians, because I can't use another word that's going to be published publicly. But I do think that it would be a good idea if medical professionals just start registering to vote as independent. If you label yourself Republican or label yourself Democratic, you've lost credibility in the minds of at least half the population. So you need to feel free based on your medical opinion, based on science, based on things you know to be true, to disagree equally frequently with the Republicans as you disagree with the Democrats. And when doctors start being politicians, that's just unacceptable. We got to put the brakes on that. That's just wrong. Now, very few physicians are self-employed now. I think that's a travesty because when you're beholden to some non-medical person who writes your paycheck every day, you don't have the luxury to stand up and be an advocate for your patients. So there's a tremendous need for medical professionals, and if what you believe to be true is contrary to the thinkings of your boss, find another job. There's no shortage of places where medical professionals can work. If you're good at what you do, you can find another job in a day. So I really think we need to start thinking independently and being more advocates for our patients. And as long as we allow the politicians and the businessmen and the people who run the drug companies and the people who run everything but practice medicine, insurance companies at all, they can't be the basis for policy decisions on an ongoing basis, or we're all in real trouble. I hope it's not too late to take this posture, but I challenge you to give it some thought and share this with our colleagues. That's it for now. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome your suggestions for future topics. And if you want to suggest an idea for another episode of the Wise Medical Minute, send it to me at info@wisemedicalcenter.com. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Wise Medical Minute with Dr. Thomas Locke. Dr. Locke addresses current events as well as important medical issues using responsible, unbiased journalism approached from a medical perspective. We invite you to submit questions or comments or suggestions for future topics by email to info@wisemedicalcenter.com. Again, thank you for viewing the Wise Medical Minute.